So, participles. Let me go to this section here. Where are we at? So the form, again, it's really not going to look that different from an adjective. You're going to notice that it's got the masculine singular has no suffix, feminine singular is going to be komet or this segel tav or patak tav. Anytime you see like a short vowel plus tav, that's a good indication that you've got feminine singular. Hirik yod mem is masculine plural, just like a noun, and then holam vav tav is feminine plural, just like a noun. As far as the form of the root goes, this is one reason why one of my Hebrew professors referred to the participles as participles, just to help you remember that in the count active, the participle is going to begin with an O-class vowel. That's this holam that you see here. That holam will tend to stay there throughout the various forms. And so far, we haven't really learned any forms of a verb that have a holam in the first root letter. So that will be distinctive. That will be a good clue that you're looking at a participle. Once you've identified it as a participle, because again, I could say that it's also got the sere in the R2 letter, the theme vowel here, but that is obviously going to reduce when you add suffixes, so that's not very reliable. But this O class, this holam in the first root letter, that's relatively reliable. Once you identify that, you'll also be able to see that it's got these adjective endings that will help you parse out the person and number. I'm sorry, not the person and number, the number and gender. And that's pretty much everything you need to know. You need to know what the root is, you need to know that it's a participle, and you need to know the gender and number. And that's most of your parsing information. Once you've got that, once you know exactly what you're looking at as far as a participle goes, the question now becomes, how is it functioning? What is the participle doing? It's important to keep in mind that the participle expresses continuing action, or sometimes we call this ongoing, sometimes we call this habitual, repetitive. There are a few different ways you can describe it, but I highly recommend that you use this convention when you're translating as much as makes sense in English. Translate it with the ing suffix if you can. That's going to tell me that you know it's a participle, because we don't use the ing suffix with imperfect, we use the future tense with imperfect. So that will help me know that you see this as a participle and that you're not seeing it as like a perfect or an imperfect. Okay. Now that said, you also need to keep in mind that just like an adjective, there are three different uses, three different ways that the participle can function within a clause. Figuring out which way it's functioning, we use the same steps that we would use for the adjective. So again, the most reliable way to tell how it's functioning is to check and see whether the participle has an article. If it has an article, and its noun has an article, you can be fairly certain that this is the attributive function. So this would be the man, the writing one. So you would say the writing man, or in English, we tend to translate these participles with a relative clause, the man who is writing, okay? I hope that talking about a relative clause here, translating it with a relative clause, I hope that's not too confusing. It's just, this is how English says something like this. English doesn't tend to say the writing man. It tends to say the man who is writing. All right, and so that's the only reason we're switching to a relative clause, because English builds this phrase, or English builds this sentence differently than Hebrew does. Hebrew very commonly uses an attributive participle. But here would be, and the fact is, this relative expression, this relative clause that we use in English, that tends to be, I won't say reserved, but when you're going to move to a relative clause for translating a participle is when the participle is modifying a person. That's usually when it's going to, so what I mean is, if you were to say the running water, or the shining sun, or the what's another one? I mean, sometimes it'll depend on the participle itself. Like we would say the dying man, but we could also say the man who is dying. We could say the river that is, or the water that is running. We could say the sun that is shining. Both of those are possible translations. If you want to kind of just take a shortcut for the sake of the midterm, I would say if you default to this relative clause, you're probably going to be safe as long as the function is attributive. And that means that the participle has the article, and so does the noun. Now, the rule really is that the participle agrees with the noun, so that if they both lack the article, then that is also probably going to be attributive. Furthermore, when the participle or adjective comes after its noun, it tends to be attributive. Okay, so those are different clues to help you translate. When we look at the predicate use, that's when we bring in the to be verb. You might say, well, we had a to be verb up here, the man who is writing, but the difference is we have the relative clause, the who is writing, the man who is writing. This is not a predicate clause, because the man who is writing, that has no copula, that has no to be verb predicating. It kind of does. It's predicating the who, it's not predicating the man. What I want you to see here, the difference is the man who is writing versus the man is writing. The woman who is sitting versus the woman is sitting. The men who are walking versus the men are walking. You can hear the difference in those two. The predicate function is an actual clause. It's an actual sentence. Maybe the best way to distinguish between these would be like the shining star versus the star is shining. Okay, that's the difference between the attributive and predicative. So how do you know when a participle is predicative? The same way you know when an adjective is predicative. A participle will be predicative when its noun has the article, but the participle lacks the article. Often, the participle will precede its noun when it's predicative. You see that's not the case here, and it's not 100%, maybe it's 70%. But what is more reliable is the fact that they disagree in definiteness. The noun has the article, the participle does not. There are some occasions, just so you know, I shouldn't even mention it because you're probably not going to see it on the midterm, and if you do, I'm not going to count you out for missing this. But just so you know, there are some occasions where both the noun and the participle will lack the article. And I shouldn't say lack the article. Both the noun will be indefinite. So not only does it lack the article, it has no possessive suffix, and it's not a proper noun. And the participle as well lacks the article, but context tells you that it should be translated predicatively anyways. Those do happen, so don't think that this is a 100% airtight kind of rule. This is just a trend. The trend is that when you've got a participle functioning predicatively, it tends to lack the article, and its noun tends to have the article. All right, so that is the attributive participle, the predicative participle. And again, if you look at these, I don't want to translate with the relative clause because that gets confusing. But if I say the shining star, the word shining is an adjective. It's describing the star. So it is very true that it's very helpful to think of these participles as they are just adjectives. That's all they are. But they are adjectives that carry a verbal meaning. They're a particular type of adjective, okay? So the third use, substantival. Okay, this is when the participle is not modifying another noun in the sentence, either the subject of the sentence or the subject of the clause, or the head noun that it's attached to. In these situations, you have a naked participle it's not connected to another noun, grammatically speaking, and so it can lack the article or it can have the article. You see here, shomer, a guard, ha shomer, with no noun being modified would be the guard. Shofet, a judge, ha shofet, with no other noun being modified, that would be the judge. And then here we see ha yoshev, the inhabitant. This is actually the dwelling one, or you could say the dweller, but we don't use the term dweller. That's not really a word we use in English. The dwelling one, that's not really a word that we use in English. We do use the word inhabitant, and so that's why a better English translation of this. Now, inhabitant is not, none of these actually are participles in English. These are all nouns. But we don't have participles in English that we use substantively that make sense for these. That's why we're using nouns here. Okay, so what are the three uses of a participle? Attributive, the shining star. Predicative, the star is shining or a star is shining. And then substantival, the shiner or the one that shines would be the idea. All right, so we've got hene, anachnu, ochelim. This is that situation where you have hene with a participle. And so you want to remember up here, that's what the hene particle is doing, is it's drawing your attention, like, watch, I'm doing this. It's similar to how in English we would say, if I were to ask you, what are you doing tonight? And you were to say, I'm going to the movies. If you just take that sentence, I'm going to the movies, in isolation, the time is ambiguous. Like, are you right now? Like, is that, you say you're going to the movies, like at this moment you're going? Or, like, you can slide that into, well, you can't really slide it into the past, but you can certainly slide it into the future. I'm going to Mars in January, something like that. The I'm going to is technically like a present tense, but it gets used for the future as well. And the way you can tell what the time is the fact that you put something like tonight or yesterday or tomorrow or next week or something like that. So this hene particle here, what this is doing is it's trying to get you to look at the immediate future. And so when it says hene ani shofet, lo, like behold, watch out, I am judging, that's this idea of I'm starting to, I'm beginning to, or I'm about to, or it's imminent, as he says. So when we apply that here to B5, we've got hene anachnu. Anachnu, this is the plural, first common plural form of the pronoun. So we, lo, behold, hene, watch out, look. We, ochelim. This is a little bit tricky because you might think that these match indefiniteness because neither one has the article, but they don't. We being a pronoun, pronouns are always definite because they're referring back to a specific noun that's already been discussed. Now here, I guess we doesn't always refer, that isn't necessarily previously discussed, but the idea here is we is always definite. A pronoun is always definite. And so because this is definite and this participle lacks the article, we know that that is a predicative function here. And so lo, behold, watch out. I keep saying lo here because that was the first translation I learned of hene, but this just means look, behold. We, eating. So that's predicative, we are eating. And what that would mean, the way you would translate it is we're about to eat or something like that. We're going to eat would be fine too, I suppose, but it's that idea of the imminent future. So the question is this attributive or is this predicative? it is a little bit tricky because you don't see the article in either one, but we is definite even without the article because it's a pronoun. And that's why a noun that has a pronoun suffix, like a possessive suffix, that's also definite because it's referring to a specific person's word or, house or something like that. So number 5 would be predicative. First of all, because the participle lacks the article. Secondly, I mean, I guess unless it was just clipped out of a larger sentence, it's not a clause on its own. If you were to say, behold, maybe it's like, look, us eating or we eating or something like that. But this is one of those situations where just saying it in English kind of helps you figure it out. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense as an attributive here. So the directive hey is, think of it like a suffix. It gets added usually to a noun, and this is how I think of it in my head. Do not translate it this way because it's not English. But I think of there are 2 questions here, really. First of all, how do you know when it is the directive hey? Like, how do you know that you're seeing a directive hey? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is, once you've identified a directive hey, how does that affect your translation? How do you bring it out in your translation? So the first one, if you have a comma hey at the end of a word, there are usually 3. I would say 80 to 90% of the time, it's one of 3 situations when you have a comma hey at the end of the word. It's either a feminine singular noun or adjective, or it is a cal perfect, either 3ms or 3fs, or the cohortative. When you add when you create a cohortative, it's basically the imperfect form of the 1cs or 1cp with a comma hey on the end. Those are the 3 situations where you will regularly see a comma hey at the end of a word. If none of those 3 fit, then assume it's a directive hey. Okay, that's basically the way to go about it. Because I don't think there's anything unique about the morphology here. Like, I think that if you were to add a comma hey... Now, again, this is not the comma hey with the mapik, that is the 3fs possessive or object suffix. That is a different form. That will have the dot inside the hey, the mapik. This is actually a comma hey vowel. This is an open syllable. The mapik shows you that it's a closed syllable. So don't get that confused. But when you see just comma hey with no mapik, it'll be either a feminine singular noun or adjective, or it will be a cal perfect 3ms or 3fs, or it will be a cohortative. If none of those work, then you've got a directive hey. But if you've got a comma hey that you don't know what to do with, ask, is it on a noun? Is it, first of all, is it cohortative? Is it a feminine singular noun that has this as part of the lexical form? Like, for example, Eretz. Eretz is feminine singular, but the lexical form does not have a comma hey here. So we know then that the comma hey must be the directive hey. There's no other way to explain it. It's not cohortative because it doesn't, I guess you could say it starts with an aleph, but then you'd have to have like ratzats or something, or roots maybe, but the vowels don't work. So adding the comma hey here, that tells you that it is the directive hey. That's the only explanation that makes sense. Okay, so now when you know that you're looking at a directive hey, how do you translate it? How do you bring that out in your translation? Well, you could do a keyword like to the. Well, I guess it would have to be definite. I'm wondering if only definite nouns. I'm wondering if the comma hey I'm wondering if the directive hey makes a noun definite, because he's saying to the land, but this is obviously not. There's no definite article here, so I'm wondering if the comma hey has made this definite, or if it just should be to a land. Either way, you can simply do to or toward. I think of the comma hey as adding the suffix ward, so ward. So if this would be like earthward or landward or houseward or cityward, like toward something, like in a direction. Like upward would be to up, and downward would be to down, and forward would be to the front, and backward would be to the back. So that ward suffix, I just kind of see that stuck on the end of the noun there. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that would be both how I would identify the directive hey. I mean, it's just a comma hey. So if you see a comma hey on the end of a word, there's really probably only 4 things it can be. It's either this, or it's a feminine singular noun or adjective, cal perfect 3ms or 3fs, or cohortative. So if it's not those other 3, then it's going to be directive hey. I have a question about hollow verbs. You'll notice that the translation, at least, I shouldn't say at least, the form, at least, is different from any verbs that you've seen so far, and the translation is probably different as well. I haven't looked at how he translates them. Yeah, of course. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the forms first. A hollow verb is a verb that has 3 root letters, but the middle root letter. So kum has 3 root letters: kof, vav, and mem. Room, roots, seem, these have 3 root letters: sen, yod, and mem. The thing that makes it a hollow verb is that second root letter is technically a vowel letter rather than a consonant letter. Okay, so kum is only 2 consonants. I mean, it's 3 letters, kof, kof, vav, mem, but it's only 2 consonants, kof and mem. All right, so that's what makes it hollow. That's why we call it hollow, because it's got a consonant, and then the middle is hollowed out with a verb. All right, so that's why we call it hollow. Sometimes these are called biconsonantal, but that's why. Just call them hollow. It's, easier to say, I guess. That's what's different about them form-wise. The fact that they are missing a middle consonant is going to significantly affect how they're conjugated. It's going to significantly affect how they're spelled in different conjugations. So, because of that, the form that you're given here, the lexical form is what we call it. This is the form that you would look up in the lexicon to find the main entry for the word. The lexical form that you get here is not the CalPerfect 3MS. And the reason for that is if you were given the CalPerfect 3MS, you wouldn't have all the information you need about this word to know what it's going to do when it's conjugated. If you were given the CalPerfect 3MS of cum, you wouldn't know that the middle vowel is a shuric, because the middle vowel disappears in the CalPerfect of these hollow verbs. This would actually be com. It would be kof, patak, mem. That would be the CalPerfect 3MS form. Right, the middle letter here, the vowel letter, I should say, in the CalPerfect will disappear. It does not disappear in the imperfect. So in the imperfect, you're going to retain this form. So, for example, cum would be, like in the Cal imperfect 3MS, it would be yod, kof, shurik, mem. Now, you get a different prefix vowel than the hirik that you're used to. I believe, let's just check. I want to say it's a kametz. Let's just check and see if I'm correct about that. Yeah. So you get a kametz. Okay, we don't even need to talk necessarily about the morphology yet, like the spelling of this, but what I want you to know is the reason why you don't get the perfect form is because if you got the perfect form, you wouldn't see that this is a shurik, and you wouldn't know what forms to look for in the imperfect. So instead, they give you the infinitive construct form. So anytime you get a hollow verb in your lexicon, in your vocabulary list, you're going to be looking at the infinitive construct form. So cum does not mean he stood or he arose. Cum, literally, if you translate cum, if you see cum in the text, it's literally translated to stand or to arise. Rum would be to be exalted, to be high. Roots would be to run. Not he ran. That would be something like rats with the patach. But roots with the R2 vowel in place, that means to run. Okay, so the point is, when you get hollow verbs, they have to give you a different form of the verb than the CalPerfect 3MS, which is your normal lexical form. They have to give you the infinitive construct, the Cal infinitive construct, because that way you can see what the middle. So as you can see here, there are shurik hollow verbs like these three. There are hirik yod hollow verbs like seem or bean, and then there are holam vav hollow verbs like bo, bosh. Those are the only ones we have there. Those are the three types of hollow verbs: shurik hollow verbs, hirik yod hollow verbs, and holam vav hollow verbs. All right, so that's all I'll say unless you have some more specific questions. We'll get into more the conjugation, the spelling changes that occur with the hollow verbs. In fact, if you've got some time, if you're feeling relatively confident about your midterm, I would suggest you go ahead and read Lesson 25 just to kind of get the forms and the terms in your brain so that when we go through it next week, you've already got a little bit exposure to it. Because hollow verbs, you've finally gotten to a point where you think you understand how verbs are going to change, and then you get this, this weird sort of thing that throws a wrench into everything. So it's good to slow down. That's one reason why we've only got one lesson next week, even though we didn't have a lesson this week, is because it does take some time to process this. But I'll go ahead and just repost links. I'll do a separate announcement, just kind of like a page of, study aids for the midterm. I'll post that later today in the announcements, which I think you guys get as emails. But if you ever need to go back to it, if you just go to the announcements tab in the course, you'll see all those announcements of some videos I've done before going through specific things like the 2 stages of translation. I'm also going to repost the sort of like, what is it, like a decision tree or whatever. How do you tell if a shavah is vocal or silent? How do you tell if a dagesh is strong or weak? Because even on the final exam of this semester, final exam of second semester, students are going to still not know whether a shavah is vocal or silent and whether a dagesh is strong or weak. And if you don't know that, that is going to severely slow down your reading speed. It's not hard if you know the right rules. So both of those situations, the dagesh and the shavah, I've kind of got a cheat rule on both of those where you can just ask one question and find out what the answer is. Is it long or short? Is it vocal, long or short? Is it strong or weak, or is it vocal or silent? So I'll post those as well. Obviously, don't forget to study your vocabulary either, because we'll have vocabulary from first semester, I'm sure. Let's see. Let's talk about prepositions taking object suffixes or pronoun suffixes. So this is one place where I kind of prefer the way that Pratico and Van Pelt present information as opposed to Furtado. So let me pull up a chart from Pratico and Van Pelt. All right, so the way that Pratico and Van Pelt, where Furtado presents these 2 types of suffixes as suffixes that go on singular nouns is one type, and then suffixes that go on plural nouns is another type. Instead of presenting them that way, Pratico and Van Pelt just present it as there are two types of suffixes that go on nouns. Let me back that up here. In Hebrew, there are two sets of pronominal suffixes, type 1 and type 2. That's a better way to think about it, because if you think about these suffixes just in terms of nouns, it gets confusing when you get here to prepositions, because why does al, I think, take a plural noun suffix, and lamed takes a singular noun? Like, why do they... Well, it's not that the suffixes that al takes are plural noun suffixes. Al takes type 2 suffixes, and plural nouns take type 2 suffixes. Okay? There's just two different families of suffixes, pronoun suffixes in Hebrew. There's two different families. And so plural nouns take the second group, and singular nouns take the first group. When you get to prepositions, some prepositions take the first group, other prepositions take the second group. The good news for you is you don't have to know which prepositions take which group, because you're not going to be composing Hebrew. You're just going to be reading it. And so when you read Hebrew, you'll see, when you see al lechem, or let's say al lav instead of alo, well, you'll still know what that suffix is. You'll know it's a type 2 instead of a type 1, but that doesn't change the translation at all. You didn't need to know that. So that's the good news. You don't have to know which suffixes a particular preposition is going to take, because you're going to see it on there when you get to it. You're not going to have to create that preposition with its appropriate suffix. I hope that makes sense. So thinking of it in terms of type 1 and type 2, for me, is more helpful when you get to the prepositions, okay? Also, these suffixes are not inherently possessive. They're only possessive when we put them on nouns, because a noun can't have an object. It's not a verb. Verbs have objects, and a noun can't have a subject, because nouns don't have subjects. Nouns can function as a subject, but they don't themselves have a subject. Nouns can have possessors, and so that is the only way that you would be able to translate a suffix, a pronoun suffix on a noun, is with possession, because being the object doesn't make any sense. All right, so when we get to the nouns, they teach that singular nouns take type 1. All right, type 1 is the Hirik Yod versus the Patak Yod, the Holam Vav versus the Kametz Yod Vav, and generally speaking, the prepositions that tend to, or the suffixes that tend to lack the initial yod versus the suffixes that tend to have the initial yod. That's the difference between type 1 and type 2. All right. Now, when you get to, for example, suffixes on verbs, you'll learn about some of these alternative forms. You don't need to worry about those yet. He says the primary difference here between the type 1, which some prepositions take type 1, and singular nouns take type 1, and some prepositions take type 2, and plural nouns take type 2, but the difference primarily in form between these two is the yod at the beginning. Okay, that's the difference here. So then when he gets to prepositions here, because you can't possess a preposition, like you can't say my to, or his to, or her in, you can't possess a preposition. And a preposition doesn't have a subject, but a preposition does have an object, which is why the exact same suffix might be translated as my on a noun, but it's translated as me on a preposition, because it's an objective pronoun. It's an object pronoun on a preposition, whereas it's a possessive pronoun on a noun. All right, now, Ben, you sent a question about this with the prepositions and the suffixes. Let me see if I'm correct in figuring out one of the things you're asking here. You were asking about why, let me see here. Why do prepositions taking suffixes added to singular nouns, so lo would be an example of that, it takes the suffixes added to singular nouns, as you can see here. Why do these prepositions taking suffixes added to singular nouns need the plural section in the paradigm? If I know what you're asking, that's a great question, and here's what I think you're asking. If they take singular noun suffixes, then what is the plural? Here's the important thing to remember about these suffixes, okay? When you have a noun with a suffix, the noun has number, but the suffix itself has its own number. So for example, suso, susa, susacha, susech, susi, and susam, susan, susachem, susachen, susenu. Horse is always singular. In all of those, horse is singular. In these, the possessor is singular as well. So here it's his horse, her horse, your horse, my horse. In here, in these, horse is still singular, but the possessor is plural. Their horse. Your horse, singular horse. And then here, our, plural, our singular horse. So the same way, the prepositions also need these plural suffixes, not because the prepositions are plural, but because this could be to a single person, to him, to her, to you, to me, but it could also be a plural, it could be a plural group, to them. And so you would take the plural suffix. What you don't want to do, what you want to make sure you do, is you want to make sure that you distinguish the number of the noun, singular or plural, from the number of the suffix, singular or plural. You can have a singular noun, obviously with a singular suffix, but you can also have a singular noun with a plural suffix. Likewise, you can have a plural noun, obviously with a plural suffix, our horses, but you can also have a plural noun with a singular suffix, my horses. So I think the answer to the question that I see here is the reason why the prepositions that take the type 1 suffixes, or the suffixes that go on singular nouns, the reason why they need a plural section here is the same reason why the noun, the singular noun, would need a plural section. This plural section is not a plural noun. This is the plural form of the suffix. So again, the basic idea here is, and this is one reason why I definitely prefer to think of these suffixes not as singular noun suffixes and plural noun suffixes. I don't like that. I think of them as type 1 suffixes, which is what a singular noun will take, and some prepositions will take that as well, and type 2 suffixes, which plural nouns take, and some prepositions take that as well. But again, the number, whether the noun is singular or plural, has no effect whatsoever on whether the suffix itself is singular or plural. Those are independent of each other. Let's take a look at men with suffixes. Someone is asking about how you tell the difference between men with the 1CP versus men with the 2MS, but I think they mean the 3MS. So the 3MS has memenu, and the 1CP has memenu. So how do you tell the difference? And you don't tell the difference in the spelling, obviously, because the spelling is the same. You could ask, why is the spelling the same? Why isn't this just memeno instead of memenu? Well, unfortunately, this has to do with, I already closed it. This has to do with those alternative suffixes that Pratico and Van Pelt were talking about, because the new shurik, or the shurik instead of the whole and vav, that is an alternative suffix for 3MS. So the explanation for why it's not memeno is kind of complicated, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter why it's not. You don't need to know why it's not. You just need to know that for whatever reason, and I know it's helpful to know the reason, but I don't know the reason, so you won't either until someone who knows tells you. I don't know why they are identical. I just know that this is taking that alternative ending, and as a result, it ends up looking identical to this. So if you're reading in a translation and you see memenu, how do you know which it is? Well, context. It's kind of a bad answer to just say context, because there's going to be times, I'm sure, when context itself isn't enough to make a decision, and it truly, maybe both of them make sense in context. Maybe from him makes sense in context, and from us makes sense. In that case, you have to note the possibility that it's either one. Maybe explain which one you think is more likely. But if, for example, on a quiz you have that, which you're not going to be, you can't be given this on a quiz. Like, this is not I don't think, a fair question to give on a quiz. So if I see it on a quiz, I'm throwing it out. But ideally, if you were given memenu on a quiz and you were asked to parse it, you would give two parsings. You would give men plus the 3MS object suffix, and men plus the 1CP object suffix. There is no way to tell them apart just in and of themselves as a word. Hopefully they're in a context where the context makes clear whether we're talking about something from him or something from us. But that may not be the case, in which case you just kind of, could be both. Let's talk about volitives. I posted last week's video conference, the video I broke into chapters so you could go directly to the discussion of the volitives, as far as, like, I'm really talking about the use there rather than the form. I mean, I discussed the form, but it's really more about what is a volitive. And so I'll kind of summarize that, and then I'll refer you to that section of last week's video for a little more detail, unless anybody has some very specific questions about it, which I'm happy to answer. But I don't want to necessarily just repeat what I say in the video. That would take more time than we need. So again, the idea, what is the difference between a volitive and what we would refer to usually as an indicative or a declarative sentence or something like that? Well, the way that we usually explain a volitive is a volitive expresses the speaker's will. The volitive expresses the speaker's will. But if I were to say something like, I want a burger, I'm expressing my will. I'm telling you what I want. I want a burger. That's not a volitive, though, even though I'm expressing my will. So volitives expressing the will of the speaker isn't quite a precise enough definition. What volitives do is okay, so let's start with what indicatives or declaratives do. Declaratives provide information. That's what they do. They give information about reality or about, they don't necessarily have to be true. I could say this apple is blue, and that's still indicative. That's still declarative. It's still providing information. Volitives indirectly provide information, but their primary function is not to provide information. Their primary function is to elicit a response from the audience. So what does that mean? If I tell you I want a burger, you might say, good for you. I'm glad you want a burger. Like, that's great. Good for you. But if I were to say, bring me a burger, it would be clear that I'm expecting you to respond to my statement. If I were to say, I want to go shopping, it's not clear that I expect you to do anything specific in response to that. I'm just stating what I want. I'm still expressing my will. That's what I want. I want to go shopping. But if I were to say, let's go shopping, I'm expressing it in such a way that it expects a response. It's asking for a response. It's asking for you to change your behavior in response to what I'm saying. That's the difference between a volitive and an indicative or a declarative. Declarative's primary function is to communicate information. Obviously, if I'm expecting you to respond to my will, then I'm communicating my will in the process. But the goal isn't just to communicate. The goal is to affect. The goal is to change the audience, to get them to respond in some way. So when I expect you, the person I'm addressing, to respond, we call that the imperative. The second person volitive is referred to as the imperative. When I expect myself to be involved in the response to my will, when I expect myself to be involved in the fulfillment of the desire that I've expressed, that's when I use the cohortative. So, may I live a long life. I'm expecting myself to fulfill that. Let's go shopping. I'm expecting myself, along with whoever I'm talking to, together. I'm included in the fulfillment of the desire. When I'm included, we call that the cohortative. And then finally, we don't do this much in English, which is why translations are so weird. But when I'm talking to you, and I'm expressing to you a desire that I have that some third party would fulfill. I'm not expecting you to fulfill this desire. I'm not expecting myself to fulfill this desire. I'm expecting some third party to fulfill it. That's when I use what Hebrew calls the jussive, or the third person volitive. Okay? First person, if you're thinking of person as far as verbs go in terms of communication, the first person is the speaker. So when the speaker is speaking about themselves, they use the first person. The second person is the one spoken to. The second person is the addressee. So that's why we say second person for you. Third person would be a third party that is not participating in the conversation. I'm not talking to them, and they're not listening to me necessarily. That's why we call it third person. It's a third party. Some examples of this would be, famously in Hebrew, in the biblical text, would be the blessing of Aaron. We usually translate this as, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. May the Lord be gracious to you and give you peace. When we use the word may in the translation there, that's fine. It's appropriate. That is one thing that we do to communicate this third person volitive in English. But it can be confusing because we also use the word may, or when we say let's go shopping, let us go shopping. Well, we also use the word let, and we use the word may to talk about permission in English. That gets confusing because volitives are not about permission. Volitives are about expressing desire and expecting a response, or expecting a fulfillment of that will or desire. So don't think that when it says, may the Lord bless you and keep you, don't think that Aaron is asking for permission from you that God would bless you and keep you. May the Lord bless you and keep you. That's not what's going on. He's saying, and I think it might be more effective to translate it as, the Lord bless you and keep you. It's almost like saying, pass me the salt. That would be an imperative. Except I don't want you to pass me the salt. I want God to pass me the salt. But I'm not talking to God, so I'm using the third person. I would say, the Lord pass me the salt. I know it sounds silly when we put pass the salt in there, but that's the idea. Is it's like an imperative, but we're making it clear that this imperative, and again, don't get imperative confused with a command or an order, is one type of imperative. So not all imperatives are commands. You make requests using the imperative as well. But if I say, the Lord bless you and keep you, I'm talking to you, but I'm not expecting you to fulfill that wish of mine. I'm not expecting you to fulfill my desire that the Lord bless you. I'm expecting a third party to fulfill it. That's why I'm using the jussive. That's why I'm using the third person volitive. Jesus does something similar in Mark chapter 8, where he says, this is right after Peter he says, who do you say that I am? Peter says, you're the Christ. And Jesus, congratulates him. I guess it's in Matthew where he says, flesh and blood have not revealed this to you. But in Mark, I'm only saying this because I know what the actual forms are in Mark, and I'm not sure in Matthew. But he then goes on to say, this is what's going to happen to me. I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be handed over to the religious leaders, and they're going to put me to death. And after 3 days, I'll rise again. And Peter says, nope. And Jesus says, yup. and says, "Get behind me, Satan." And then after that, he calls the crowds to him, and he says, "If anyone would follow after me," he doesn't say, if any of you would follow after me, you must deny yourselves, take up your cross, and follow me. He doesn't say you must. He doesn't say if any of you want to follow. He says, if anyone would follow after me, let him take up his cross. Jesus isn't saying, give him permission to take up his cross. He isn't saying, don't get in the way of that guy taking up his cross. He's not saying allow him to take up his cross. He's using the word, well, in English, we're putting the let in there to point to a third-person volitive. In Greek, we call it a third-person imperative. But that's what we're doing is, in that verse, Jesus is expressing his will, his desire. If anyone wants to follow after me, he must take up his cross. It's more direct than he must. Jesus isn't saying it's necessary for him to take up his cross. Jesus is giving a command to someone that he's not talking to, because he's talking to you all. And he doesn't say, if any of you would follow after me. Jesus is saying, if anybody would follow after me, if anybody out there, if any of those people would follow after me, pick up their cross, they must, but it's not they must, it's do it. He's actually commanding the people that he's not even talking to, pick up his cross. Okay, so it's hard to talk about this in English because we just don't do that. We don't have these first and third person volitives in English the same way that Hebrew and Greek do. But the point is, when you see a volitive in Hebrew, you need to understand that the speaker is communicating his or her will. This is what the speaker's will is. And the person of that volitive, if it's first person, second person, or third person, tells you who the speaker expects to fulfill that desire. If it's first person, they expect themselves to participate in the fulfillment. If it's second person, they expect the addressee, the person that they're speaking to fulfill the will that they've expressed. And if it's third person, or if it's jussive, I should say, that indicates that they're expecting someone other than themselves or the addressee to fulfill what they're communicating. So we'll do number one here. All right. Unfortunately, it's imperative, which is pretty straightforward because we have that in English, but hey, it's short. So, Shema et divrei hanavi ha-yesharim. Okay, so we've got Shema, and we're going to anticipate that the first thing we see in the sentence is the predicate, and it's the main verb. It's not a perfect conjugation, though it's very close. Perfect 3ms is what we would be looking at, but that has a kametz in R1. Here instead, we have a shava in R1. And if we've got a shava in R1, it's a very good chance that we're looking at either an infinitive construct or an imperative. Since there's no suffix, that would make this imperative 2ms. So it could be either one. These two forms, well, actually, if it were the infinitive construct, it would probably be shemoah, not shema. So I'm pretty sure this is imperative, especially since this is the volitives lesson. So we're going to go ahead and land on imperative here. So this is listen or hear, something like that. It's given in the 2ms, so it's speaking to a singular person. And then we have the definite direct object marker here. So whatever it is that the addressee is supposed to hear or listen to, that's this thing, whatever comes after et. This is the object of listen. Listen to what? Listen et divrei hanavi. All right, so as we look at divrei hanavi, the first thing I notice about divrei is the sere yod ending. That tells me that this is a construct noun, and it's masculine plural. So this would be words, because it's plural, and since it's construct, it's going to be words of. Now I need to find the absolute, because if I have a construct here, if I have a construct noun, I'm going to have an absolute to end the chain. Well, what do you know? The very next word has a definite article. That means that the very next word cannot be a construct, so this is my absolute. Ha-navi, the prophet. So what I've got here is words of the prophet. Since the definiteness of the construct is determined by the definiteness of its absolute, and the absolute is definite, this would be the words of the prophet. So this is hear or listen to the words of the prophet, ha-yesharim. Yeshar is the root here. I've got a hirik yod mem suffix, so this is masculine plural, and it's also definite. So what does yashar mean? Yashar itself means right, correct, just. It can even mean something like straight sometimes. Proper. So yashar means proper or right. But what is yashar modifying? Is it modifying anything? If not, then it would be a substantive. It would be kind of functioning as a noun. But is there some noun that it's modifying? Well, let's look back at all the nouns we have here and see if it makes sense for this to be modifying one. The first noun we have is divrei, words of, and then we have prophet. So is it the proper words of the prophet, or is it the words of the proper prophet? And we know that yesharim modifies divrei because yesharim is plural. Now you might say, well, why is it hirik yod mem here and sere yod here? Why are they different endings? Because yesharim is not in construct. It's modifying a noun in construct, but this word itself is not in construct. In fact, adjectives, unless they're functioning substantively, won't be in construct. So this just, right, straight, whatever, proper. This is modifying words. So now we have listen to or hear the just or upright words of the prophet. Okay, so again, that was pretty straightforward. It's imperative. We know imperative. We'll do a jussive or a cohortative next. But any questions about number 1 there?
So the only difference in that cheval not being called perfect 3ms is just that cheval that was underneath it?
Yeah, this is not Cal Perfect 3ms because if it were, we would have a kametz under R1, the shin, rather than the cheval. The cheval tells us that, well, let me just put it this way. The only forms we've seen so far, verbal forms that we've seen so far with a cheval in the first root letter, are going to be the, there's all kinds of qualifications. Because we've seen this in the Cal Perfect in the 2MP and the 2FP, those heavy endings. The R1 vowel gets shortened, but those have suffixes 10 and 10. But here, we know that this is not Cal Perfect because, I guess this would be the way that I look at it first. This has no suffix, right? Since it has no suffix, the only perfect it could be would be Cal Perfect 3ms. And it's not that because that would have a kametz. Well, what about imperfect? Well, imperfect always has a prefix, and this has no prefix, so it can't be imperfect. What about infinitive? Well, infinitive starts with a, sorry, one second. The infinitive construct has a cheval in R1, so that's why I thought maybe this is infinitive construct, but then I realized infinitives really want to preserve the holum in R2 if they can. And I happen to remember, just from what I've seen of Hebrew, that shema in the infinitive construct does have a holum. It would be shmoah. And so I know that this is not the infinitive construct. So what am I left with? Well, we've done perfect, we've done imperfect, we've done infinitive construct. Infinitive absolute does not have a reduced vowel in R1. Imperatives, if there is no suffix, actually there's one that, but imperative is the next option. And then I guess the only other form that we have also done would be participle, but participle does not have a cheval. So what I've basically done is I've gone through all of the conjugations that we've learned so far, asking what does this conjugation require? So the perfect requires a suffix, unless it's 3ms, in which case this might work, but it lacks the kametz that it would need. Imperfect requires a prefix, which we don't have. Infinitive construct requires an O-class vowel, which we don't have. Infinitive absolute requires a long or medium vowel in R1, which we don't have, and a holum in R2. Imperative works, and participle requires an O-class, not a cheval in R1. So the only conjugation we've learned so far that actually works here is the imperative 2ms specifically, because that's the only imperative that has no suffix. So that's kind of the process I'm going through to figure out what conjugation am I looking at. Well, what conjugations have we seen? What do each of those conjugations require? Only one of those conjugations has, or I'm sorry, what we have here only works with one of those conjugations. Now, again, the more you do this reading, translating, parsing, the more shortcuts, the more intuition will kick in, the quicker you'll be able to do it. But at the very beginning point, if you're just not sure where to start, where I would start is, let's just go through all the conjugations we've learned and see which conjugations this fits. If I happen to have 2 or 3 conjugations that are possible, then I can narrow it in a little bit, which I did have. Both the infinitive construct and the imperative could have worked here, except for the fact that the infinitive construct has a second requirement of the R2 holum that this one does not fulfill. The first thing to look at is the letters, for sure. That's going to tell you most of what you need to know. But when you look at the letters, you see 3 root letters here. You just got to realize there are several conjugations where that's possible. That's possible in the Cal Perfect 3ms, but it's also possible in the infinitive construct. It's also possible in the infinitive absolute and in the imperative 2ms. It's possible to have 3 root letters in the participle. So what else do each of those conjugations require to help us narrow down? Well, if it's Cal Perfect 3ms, it's going to have the kametz patak pattern. And that's why it's important to also be aware of what the vowels will do in these conjugations. So number 8, we've got Nishlacha et avdei hamelech el ha'ir veyivne bayet lo sham. All right, so again, starting at the front, I'm going to anticipate the predicate. That means I'm going to be looking for either a predicative adjective or participle or some sort of a verb. If this is a verb, I have too many letters to have the root. Hebrew verbal roots have 3 letters, I have 5. So what's extra? What's been added? Well, we know that there are certain conjugations that will add a kametz heh. For example, the Cal Perfect 3ms ends in a kametz heh for third heh verbs, but we've got way more than 3 letters. The Cal Perfect 3fs ends in a kametz heh, but we've still got too many letters for that, and the second to last letter would be a tav in that situation. What else ends with kametz heh? There are no imperfects that end with kametz heh. There are no infinitive constructs that I can think of that end with kametz heh. No infinitive absolutes. There are some infinitive absolutes that end in sere heh, but not kametz heh, I think. What about participles? Well, a cal active participle in the feminine singular would end in a comet hey. Is it possible that that's what we have? Maybe. Let's put that in reserve. We'll write that down. Maybe we have a cal active participle feminine singular. But there's one more conjugation that adds a comet hey, and that's the cohortative. If it's cohortative, then the first letter will be either a noun or an aleph. And sure enough, we have a noun hiric. Well, what if I just take those off? I take off the noun hiric, I take off the comet hey. That would presuppose that this is a cohortative 1CP. Then I'm left with shalach, shen lamed chet. Sure enough, that's a verb that I've learned. So this is almost certainly, this cohortative parsing makes more sense of this than if this were a participle, since cal active participle is the only one we've learned. This would have to be something like, I mean, the verbal root would still have to be like 4 letters. So this is a cohortative 1CP form of shalach. Shalach means he sent. So the cohortative would be something like, let us send, or may we send, or something like that. Again, the speaker is expressing a desire that something be sent, but he's anticipating, or she's anticipating, that he or she will be involved in the fulfillment of that. So the way we would say that in English is, we don't just say, I want to send, because that's not volitive, that's just stating information. Instead, we express the desire, we exert the desire by saying something like, may we send, or let us send, or let's send. I guess in English, when it's cohortative, it's more common. We rarely say let us do this. That's more permission. But when it's cohortative, we usually say let's do this. It's a contraction. So I would translate this as let's send. But again, that's just a preliminary translation. We're not in stage 2, how would English build this sentence yet. So we're just analyzing the Hebrew word here. This is a verb. It's probably our main verb, but we'll continue on. Next, we see the et particle, which tells us whatever comes after this, this is our direct object. So this is that thing that the speaker wants sent. What does the speaker want sent? Avdei. Okay, so avdei, the first thing I notice about avdei is the sera yod. That tells me that this is a noun, that it's masculine plural, and it's in construct. So now I have to find its absolute, because any construct will be part of a construct chain that ends with an absolute. Sure enough, the very next word starts with the definite article. That means this is the absolute. This is where the chain ends. If I take off the definite article, I get melech, which is a word that I know. This is the word for king. All right, so we talked about the form of avdei, but we haven't talked about what it means yet. So avdei, if I take off the sera yod, I'm left with ayin patak beit shava dalet. Well, that can't be the lexical form because I've only got one vowel here, avd. So the vowels have changed somehow. So now I have to think about what nouns have I learned that have ayin beit dalet. And this is where connecting the nouns that share a root with a verb to that verb. Because I'm going to recognize the root as related to the verb more often than I'm going to recognize it related to the noun. So this root, avad, this is the root for serve. There's also a very similar root, avad, with an aleph in R1 instead of an ayin. That's the word for perish. This is not that one. This is the one for serve. So what is the noun built off of this root? Well, if the verb built off this root is he served, the noun built off of this root is servant. So what does the speaker want sent? The servant, because the absolute is definite, the servant of, actually the servants of the king. The servants of the king. So this is my definite direct object. All right. Where does he want them sent? I only know to ask the question where because I see the next word here, and I see that this is a preposition of location. This is the word el, or direction. Preposition of location, preposition of direction. El means to. So where does he want the servants of the king sent? To what? To ha'ir. I see a hey. Hey, that might be the definite article. I don't have a dagesh in the next letter, but that's because it's a guttural, and gutturals reject the dagesh. And as a result, we've got compensatory lengthening. The patak lengthens to a kametz. Ha'ir. If I take off the definite article, I get ir, which is the lexical form that I've learned for city or town. So the speaker wants the servants of the king sent to the town. And then we've got ve yevnu. Now this is a little bit tricky because this looks really, really similar to a verb that I'm used to seeing, but there are some problems with that. So as I look at this word, there's a few things that jump out at me. First of all, this vav here, this strikes me as the conjunction. I mean, what my instincts are telling me, what my intuition is telling me can't be true, because you haven't learned this yet. So I have to break down my intuition and look at this from a different perspective. So because I don't know what this is right now, honestly. I'm still thinking through it. So we take off the vav. That's going to be the conjunction. We're left with yod, hiric, bait. Yeah, it has to be a verb. It's just not the type of verb that I'm thinking of. All right, so this is, which probably seems obvious to you guys because the type of verb I'm thinking of comes later, but it's way more common than what we're looking at here. So this must be the vav conjunction, and then we've got a yod, bait, noon, shurik. So my hunch is this is a verb. If it's a verb, we've got too many letters. Do we ever add a shurik as a suffix? Yes, we do that in a lot of situations. What about a noon shurik? Well, we do that too. So is this a 1CP suffix, new? Or is this just a 3CP or 3MP suffix, oo? Furthermore, what's going on with the yod hirik over here? I'm used to that being a cal imperfect prefix. Could this be cal imperfect? Well, if it is, that would explain the yod hirik and the shurik, which would leave me with bait and new. Whoops, I'm not supposed to look at that yet. I don't like going through these with the answers right next to me because I feel like I'm cheating. If the yod hirik is the prefix, then the shurik would be part of the suffix of a 3MP form, and we'd be left with bait noon in the root. So that means that we will have lost a consonant. So far, we've learned about a few different types of verbs that lose consonants in the cal imperfect. One is the one yod, either the true one yod or the one yod vav, which has to do with the prefix. We have either a hirik yod or a sere prefix. That's not what we have. The other one is the one noon, where the noon assimilates into R2. That has not happened. The other common one is the third hey, which when we have a third hey verb in the cal imperfect and we have a vocalic suffix, the segel hey drops off altogether. That would make sense because if I take the root beit noon hey, that's a root that I know. That's bana, he built. So in the imperfect, it would be he will build. In the imperfect 3MP, it would be they will build. And then we've just added a conjunction to that. All right, so and they will build. What will they build? Bayit. Now I don't have the definite direct object marker on bayit, but that's because bayit is not definite. This isn't they will build the house, this is they will build a house. So we can't use the definite direct object marker. They will build a house, lo, to him or for him, and then sham, this is an adverb. It just means in that place, in that location, or we could simply say there. They will build a house for him or to him there. All right, so I've analyzed all of the Hebrew words, grammatically at least. I've discussed a little bit syntactically, that's the function. I've asked a few questions about the function, not exhaustively, but enough to where I think I'm ready to start building this sentence in English. So now I'm going to move into stage 2 of translation, which is how would English build this sentence? So English, what do you want first in your sentence? English always wants the subject first, almost always. All right, so let me come back here to the Hebrew and find my subject. What is my subject? Well, I don't have a subject in Hebrew. So I have to infer the subject from the form of the main verb, which is a first person verb, which would be something like we. So I'm going to put we as my subject. All right, English, what do you want after the subject? Give me the main verb. Okay, well here, again, it is send, but it's this volitive send. It's more like, instead of send, it's more like, there's a lot of ways we could do it. We could do may we send? We could do we should send, or we must send. But in English, those are not volitive. Those are indicative. So I want to avoid those at least in first year. Another thing we could do, which is what Furtado does, he says, let us send, or I might just say, let's send. And again, that gets a little bit tricky because we've now erased the subject. But again, English with its volitives, that's one situation where we don't necessarily start with the subject. You know, if I say, pass me the salt, there's no subject in that sentence at all. The volitives are one place where English doesn't start with a subject. All right, so we've got let's send. Okay, what do you want, English, after the main verb? Give me the rest of the predicate in this order of preference. I want a standalone indirect object that is a non-prepositional indirect object first. We don't have one of those. After that, I want the direct object. What's our direct object? Et avdei hamelech, okay? So that is going to be, let's send the servants of the king. That is my direct object. Then English is going to want any prepositional indirect object, which we don't have. Then it's going to want any sort of prepositional modifiers. So that's where we would add something like to the city. Servants of the king to the city, okay? And that's really the end of our first clause, at least. This conjunction begins a new clause because we've got a new main verb. So we could either put a period here and then say and something, or we could put a comma and, either way. And then we start with a new clause. English, what do you want first in your clause? Give me the subject, okay? So we come back here. What's our subject? Well, we don't have a subject in Hebrew. So we have to infer the subject from the form of the verb. This is a third person plural. So the subject we use in English for third person plural is they. And they. All right, English, what do you want after the subject? Give me the main verb of the clause. That's build, okay? But this is imperfect, so we're going to say they will build. All right, English, what do you want after the verb? The main verb. Well, first, it would want any non-prepositional indirect object, which we don't have. We'll come back to this because this is an important point, but I don't want it to be too confusing here. We don't have a non-prepositional indirect object. So then we go to the direct object. That would be house. Build a house. Then what comes after the direct object? Then any prepositional indirect object would come. That's what we have here. For him. This marks the indirect object, but it marks it with a preposition. Now, when I say prepositional, I'm talking about in English. For him. This is a perfectly legitimate English translation. For is a preposition. For him. And then any other modifiers. Give me the rest of what you have in the sentence. Sham. Sham is an adverb. What does it modify? It modifies build. Where will they build it? There. So this can go, they will build there a house for him. They will build a house there for him. They will build a house for him there. Any of those work. Especially they will build a house there for him. That's perfectly legitimate translation in English. I could be done here. Or I could move there to the end. They would build a house for him there. That's also perfectly legitimate. If you did either of those two translations, you would get full credit. Okay. Those are first-year Hebrew translations. Let's go back to that prepositional versus non-prepositional indirect object idea. This would be a second-year Hebrew translation. What if instead of for him, a prepositional indirect object, I used a non-prepositional indirect object? If I do that in English, a non-prepositional indirect object has to go after the verb but before the direct object. So it has to go here. But if you read this, it makes perfect sense. Let's send the servants of the king to the city, and they will build him a house there. That works. The problem is if I see this on a translation in first year, I'm not certain whether or not you knew what lo was, because I don't see lo reflected in your translation. It is reflected here, but you've made an interpretive decision that you haven't really learned about yet. You'll learn about this in second year. So I expect to see for him, lo, literally for him somewhere in this sentence. And you've probably never even noticed that before. But when you have a preposition on the indirect object, it comes after the direct object. When you have no preposition on the indirect object, it comes before the direct object. It's weird how English does that, but that's the way English, it does. That's a rule that English seems to follow. So anyways, that's a lot of information that isn't super important. The really important thing we wanted to get to here was how to translate this cohortative. If you see a singular cohortative, I would translate it as let me blank. If you see a plural cohortative, I would translate it as let us blank. And that would be kind of the end. In that case, I'll shut it down. Feel free to email me any questions you have. I'll answer them anytime. Don't wait till the last minute to take your midterm, because bad things happen to students who open it at 11 p.m. Plus, your proctor doesn't really want to stay up that late anyways. So be judicious, but take your time and send me any questions you have.